Hello there, my name is Mike. I'm not a YouTuber, so I apologize for the quality of the video. I hope you can excuse it. I've been playing a lot of Soulframe here the last week and a half or so since I got alpha access, and I want to offer a little bit of feedback on the melee system. First, I'd like to talk really briefly about the enemy AI and some issues I was having just fighting groups in general. Starting off with the arrow and grenade spam, it seems like the cooldown between arrow shots from the rangers and the grenades from the melee enemies is very, very short. It can make for a very frustrating fight when you have to kite the melee enemies around a large area just to prioritize your ranged enemy that is just raining down arrows on you the entire time. Likewise, when you're kiting around trying to get a better position, some enemies will fall out of range of you and will start throwing grenades, and it just leads to further running and kiting and less engaging with the enemies and more just running away from them and praying for an opportunity to jump in and attack. Another frustration I was having was the enemy's tendency to backpedal away from you when you're trying to get in range to hit them with your sword, and the range of the sword hits not connecting. It feels like the sword hits should be pulling me a little bit closer to the enemies, or their backpedaling shouldn't be quite as aggressive, or the range of the sword swings needs to be lengthened quite a bit. There's plenty of times where I could actually see the sword make contact with the enemy model, and it would act as if I had not hit them. And then my last point on the enemy AI, and this is, it's kind of AI related, it's kind of animation. The wind-ups for various attacks are very, very hard for me to read. I don't know if this is a me problem or if it's the animations and everything in the game. But judging between a quick light attack versus the wind-up for a heavy attack, in the split second that you need to be able to block or parry that quick attack, is extremely frustrating when you stand there spamming your block or parry button after thinking that it was going to be a quick attack, but then it's a wind-up for a much larger attack. I think a clear distinction of the attacks and the kinds of attacks would be really beneficial, at least to me. Next, I wanted to talk about the target lock-on and how finicky it can be with thrown weapons, melee, and with smite. Trying to smite a specific enemy is very frustrating when it locks onto another enemy, even though you are pointing directly at the enemy that you want to smite or hit. I ran into that quite a bit, especially with the larger melee groups, where one enemy would have smite on them and I'm trying to target them, but for whatever reason my character is locked on another enemy. And then other instances where I expect the lock-on to lock onto an enemy for me to hit, and I end up swinging in a completely different direction. And I played a considerable amount of my playtime with the flyblades, and they have this really annoying tendency to lock onto barrels and crates, even when there are enemies around. They will also randomly lock onto a specific enemy while trying to target another enemy, and then other times you will throw and it will just go wherever your crosshair is pointing with no lock-on whatsoever. It's super inconsistent, it feels super janky and clunky to try to play with. Most of the time I ended up just throwing the fly blades in a circle around me rather than trying to mess with actually throwing them. Thirdly, I'm having some difficulty wrapping my head around the parry and block system in the game. This is a combination of kind of what I mentioned earlier, where the enemies are very difficult for me to read between heavy, light attacks. I also have some difficulty discerning where in the attack I need to parry. It seems like there are lots of attacks that you parry very early on in the animation, and it will interrupt the rest of the animation. While other attacks you have to parry almost at the end of the animation for it to get the parry in. Playing melee, especially with the long blades that I was using, parrying is pretty much your biggest damage window. So being able to hit them consistently is pretty important to being able to actually kill the enemies and obviously stay alive, because it's limiting the amount of damage that you're taking. Getting a good parry in also feels unoptimal frequently, especially when you're dealing with a large group of enemies, because it kind of locks you into that riposte animation. And parrying one enemy, their attack will not line up with another enemy standing next to you, so you end up taking damage from the second enemy while trying to parry the enemy that you're actively fighting. So you kind of end up with this issue where you're trying to play skillfully and get your parries in to open up that damage window for riposte, but being forced to kite out a very large group of enemies, even 2, maybe 3 enemies, can be an issue. You can see I'm dealing with that in the B-roll footage I've got playing right now. To me, this kind of just discourages melee play in general. A lot of the melee fantasy is to be able to go in toe-to-toe with the enemy and just brawl it out. And the game kind of punishes you for trying to do that without just kind of kiting around, staying out of reach of enemies, dodging more than you were blocking or parrying. And then the last thing I have to say on the parrying and blocking, it's difficult to tell when the parry starts, or when the block starts rather. The animation is kind of muddy, and I will have a block animation, my character is holding his sword up and blocking, and for whatever reason the enemy will just attack through it and still hit me. I think it needs to be cleared up exactly when your block goes into effect, even if it's just a little flash on your character or something. Just something so that I know that I missed the parry, and not that I was in another animation and I made the blocking animation, but it hit me anyway. So with all that said, I kind of want to just talk about the general flow of combat, and it kind of takes everything that I've already said and puts it all together to make the flow of melee combat just feel clunky and not great. You feel like you're spending more time dodging away, avoiding enemies. You can't parry or block because too many enemies are attacking you all at the same time, with a mixture of heavy and light attacks, quick attacks, all of that stuff. You're getting smacked around quite a bit. You have to face tank quite a bit of enemy fire. You're spending a lot of time avoiding arrows and grenades, and way less time actually engaging with the enemies, fighting them, and being able to deal some damage. You also have issues where the animation for an ability will frequently be longer than the little stun that it gives the enemies around you, meaning that it's actually a really bad idea to use an ability that would give you a buff or give you some damage, because you're going to get hit by 3 enemies the second you use it. I think the best way I can describe it is that it makes the combat just feel disjointed and clunky. The last point I wanted to touch on was the balance between the different weapons and the pacts. Being melee, I started out with the Tethrin, which has a very overpowered number 1 ability that amplifies your damage on subsequent hits. I did not realize that this was overpowered until I switched to the Bromius pact, and was dealing absolutely no damage for the first 20 to 25 levels, before the jump ability started being able to knock enemies out. Without diving into more complicated builds and things, I was not able to get the Bromius pact to perform anywhere near as well as Tethrin when battling bosses or chunkier enemies. On lighter enemies, it was great. It had great AoE and would one-shot most any regular enemy that I would run into in a group. That's not to say that I think Tethrin needs a nerf. Rather, Bromius and the other packs that don't have that level of damage could probably use a buff. I did not feel any tankier using Bromius than I did with Tethrin, and Tethrin's heal on kill was absolutely clutch, whereas Bromius could only heal on smite. I had basically the same experience when I switched over to Garen Rube, where I was still not able to get damage comparable to Tethrin, even remotely close to it, even though its abilities do seem strong and useful. And then with playing with different weapons, I went from using primarily long blade and fly blade to sword and shield and short blade. I noticed that the skill tree for the shield is, for whatever reason, completely bare of any real defensives, while the long blade had more parry window lengthening nodes and things of that nature. I'm not sure what's going on with that, but it kind of felt really weird going to sword and shield and feeling squishier and more defenseless than when I was using the long blade. I just kind of wanted to touch on that. I don't have a whole lot of comments beyond just the general feeling that I get from it, even though chucking the shield around is a lot of fun. I felt like it was really poorly integrated with the rest of the weapons. If you're still listening, I really appreciate you sitting through my rambling about the melee in the game. Just a TLDR, the enemy AI needs some work, I feel, particularly around the arrows and grenades and kind of their movement. The lock-on system needs reworking for smite, enemy lock-on, and thrown weapons. The block and parry feels very inconsistent, difficult to use, combined with the animations of enemies, the parry timing not being super clear, and the animations kind of being weird on the character, where it feels like enemies are hitting through a block. And then the combat flow just generally needs some work for melee, because it feels like the game is centered around ranged weapons, where you're able to dodge out of groups and still deal damage and bounce around a little bit more than melee, where you're in the thick of it and getting hammered on the entire time. And lastly, tethering seems a little overpowered in terms of balance, and the fantasy on the different weapon classes also feels a little bit off, particularly with the sword and shield that I've experienced. So thank you very much for listening. Any feedback on my points or counterpoints or whatever toward it are very much appreciated in the comments. I'm going to go ahead and post this over on the feedback forum as well, so I'll be keeping an eye on that to see what other people have to say. Yeah, thanks for watching.